The passage that I want to share with you this morning comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. If you have your pew Bibles with you, First Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. If you have your pew Bibles with you, it's page 848. And if you have your phone Bible, it's, okay, which page, I'm not sure, you have to check. But 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, Paul says this to the Corinthian church. Paul says, "When I came to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I came to you in weakness and fear and with much trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power." Amen. This past week, it was an interesting week for me this past week because if you take a look at our bulletin, we have a missionary song who we support in Indonesia, and then we're ready to launch Little Neck campus up in Little Neck, and I was there not last night, excuse me. I was there yesterday, Saturday, for a missions conference, and it is very close with the senior pastor, and they've had a missions conference called the Ambassadors Conference for the last 2 years. And then this one was a conference, but an interesting conference because of the 6 speakers. Last year and the year before, they also hosted an Ambassadors Conference where there were 2 years ago they had a conference where there were 20 speakers. Within 3 days, 20 speakers, and I was like, wow, that's a lot to kind of digest. But for me, it was fun, somewhat, because there were new things that I learned that I did not learn before. So this year, it was a smaller number of speakers. And then this past week of Thursday, Friday, Saturday was a missions conference that he hosted. But the makeup of the speakers went something like this. The oldest speaker was a graduate of Westminster, and he taught at a college Bible study. So he taught at SUNY, which is the State University of New York, and they have branches just like Penn State does, just like Rutgers also has. And he was the Bible study teacher for this Christian group, Christian college students. So it turned out, of the 6 speakers, so you have the first main speaker, or not main, because there are 6 speakers. So the oldest one was their teacher. And it turned out that there were 5 other students. And it turned out the 5 of them, 4 are missionaries and 1 is a professor. And it turned out that when I saw the list, so they all graduated from SUNY Stony Brook. And then they all graduated from Westminster Seminary. They also got their MDivs, THMs, and PhDs. So they're either professors or missionaries. Missionary in China, missionary in Africa. So the one missionary, or 2 of the missionaries, I had not seen for about close to 30 years. I was at Westminster from about 89 to about 92. So of the 6 speakers, I knew 4 of them from Westminster days. So I was like, some of them I have not seen for over 20 years. So I wanted to say hello. I wanted to see how they're going. And then the funny thing that always happens goes something like this. About a month ago, I visited a church up in New York, and he was also at Westminster, and I had not seen him he went up to New York in 91. So I hadn't seen him for 27 years. I went to their Wednesday night service, and after the Wednesday night service, I walked up to him, and he looked at me, and he says, in the Korean service, he says, "안녕하세요?" And I said, "안녕하세요?" And he said, and I knew, you know how when you meet someone and they don't know who you are, right? So I hadn't seen him for 27 years, and he hadn't seen me for about 27 years. So we said, "안녕하세요." I knew who he was, but did he know who I was? He looked at me, he's like, with that, "Who are you?" kind of, and I said, "My name." In Korean, I said, Yi Guangho. My name is Guangho Lee. And he said, he was shocked because he hadn't seen me for 27 years. I hadn't seen him for 27 years. And then when he was preaching for the Wednesday night service, I looked at him and he looked a little bit different. He looked a little older. But most people, if they had not seen me for 26, 27 years, the first thing they say is, where's your hair, right? First thing is, where's your hair? And I always say to them, I said, when they cannot recognize, the first thing I say to them goes something like this: just picture me with a little more hair, okay? That's the only difference, that just picture me with a little more hair, and they're like, and then they keep looking. So even yesterday afternoon when I went to the conference, at 4 o'clock, the missionary, he was out in China for a number of years. And he's right now serving at YWAM, which is in Hawaii, the Youth with a Mission. He's been there for the last 3 years. So he was sharing about his testimony, close to about last 15, 20 years. And the testimony that he shared, which was very shocking, was that he graduated from seminary, he was a pastor, and he was a missionary in China for about 7, 8 years. And then what specific circumstances, I'm not really sure, but he lost his voice. And he shared in his testimony, he said, for 2 or 3 years, I was angry with God. Why did you kick me out of China? He said, I was angry with God. He said, I did not pray for 2, 3 years. He said, I did not read the Bible for 2, 3 years. And I sat in the back and I said to myself, how difficult was it for him? But he said, after a number of years, he said, and this was very funny when he was sharing, he said, you know, God called me. He said, God called me and he said, Hungjina. His name is Hungjin. And he said, God, my name is James. He said, God, he only calls me in Korean. He says, Hungjina, Hungjina. 내가 너를 사랑하는 거 아니냐? He said, God would say, Hungjin, do you know that I love you? And he said that was the beginning and the start of his coming back to the Lord. And you know, when I heard that, I'm like, personally, like I'm sitting there, I'm like, dude, you graduated from seminary, you were a pastor, you were a missionary. How do you go through an experience like that? So in a sense, it was a little shocking for me. But God did call him back. God is using him in his ministry right now in YWAM in Hawaii. So after the service, you know, right after his part was 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock, after 5 o'clock. So right after 5 o'clock to about 6:30, it was dinner time. So right after, I walked up to him and I said, hello? And then he's like, once again, right, who are you? And I said, Kwang Lee from seminary. He says, oh, where you been? How you been? So we talked a little bit. The other people, I don't want to really go into the details, but for me personally, the other thing about this week, for me, it was very, for me, in a sense, it was very difficult or different. Because some of you know, some of you don't know. Our church, if you look at the bulletin, we support and we encourage ESPM, which is the 8th Street Peacemakers Ministry. And so earlier in the beginning of the summer, you know, I asked Phil, I said, okay, how many people do we have? Our youth group is very small right now, right? So if I remember correct, if I can, you know, someone may correct me, but before it was like, when we used to go to ESPM for summer missions, we would have maybe 7 or 8. And I still remember there were sometimes, yeah, we only had like 2 or 3 guys go with Phil too. But it was this summer, it was like, okay, so we have Ruby, we have Josh, we have Joe, we have Sarah Hong, we have Chitty. So we had 5 youth group students. And it was like, okay, Joe and Josh, of course we know, they were in India for the last 10 days. So 2 are out, so we only had the 3 girls left. And then, so it was very difficult. And then, so I said to myself, and I prayed, and I said to myself, okay, it's been such a long time. Generally when I go, or when we go, because if there's a large number, I drop them off. Phil is there generally. He'll take care of all the details. They have a group. And I drop them off, and I do other things. And then I maybe come at the end of the day, share with them the devotions. But this year I said, if no one, and the other interesting thing was the person who is in charge, his name is Pastor Andy. And he was in a conference for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And it turned out that his daughter, who had just finished first year of Penn, she is in charge. She has been in charge for the last 2 years. And so I said, okay, I don't know why, but by the providence of God, because Pastor Andy, when he came back on Thursday, he said, oh, it was good that you were here for the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And I tried to encourage them. But I decided, okay, I'm going to sleep there. But God, I know this is becoming a little more of a testimonial time, but I will get into the passage because it was, for me, a personal thing of, you know how our theme for 2018 is back to the basics. It helped me to go back to the basics. So I went, and it had been years since I'd been there like the whole day. So I went Monday morning, Tuesday morning, Wednesday, the whole day, and I looked at the program. Okay, I've been a teacher for the last 24 years. So when I see something, when I see a classroom, when I see a group, technically I can see, all the faults. I've been a teacher for 24 years because I made all those mistakes. The first 7 years in teaching in Philadelphia, I made all those mistakes. So I know when they're mistakes. But getting back to the basics, I looked at Pastor Andy's daughter, who just finished first year of college. And the conversation that I had with her went something like this. I don't know why, very short conversation was, I don't know whether Dad forced you to take over or you took over voluntarily. And I told her, I said, in my circle of I shared with you the seminary friends who I hadn't seen for 28 years. I said to Karen and Margaret, I said, your dad is one of the most respectful person in my life. I respect him more than many of my friends that I would call seminary friends that I went through. And I said, the reason why I respect your dad so much, but they kind of chuckled. They're like, oh, why? Because you know how family is family, right? We all know our faults, we all know our weaknesses and all these things. And so when I said to them, I said, I respect your dad the most. You know why? Because your dad has been here for the last 15 years, and he's been doing this ministry for 10 years with no glory, the day in and day out. One of the interesting things was, Joe and Josh, they came back from India. And Pastor Sam kind of mentioned it. He said he went to India, he visited India a number of years ago. And then the interesting thing was he came back from India, and we were at ESPN. And the comment that he made, some things that for me as a memory goes like this. Pastor Sam came to India, and he said, came from India, he saw the neighborhood, and he said, hey, Kwang, this is just like India, but the roads are paved, and the homes are, row homes. The poverty that was in that city, which is only about, from our position right now, is only about 25, 30 minutes. If we take Route 76, 476, it's about 25 minutes. So this is India, but with roads and homes. And the reason why I picked this passage of 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 5, when Paul says, and so it was with me, brothers and sisters, when I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom. Some of you know Pastor Andy. And I've known him for 10 years. And he will honestly say, and I will also confess too, I'm not very eloquent. And we kind of agreed. Andy, you're not very eloquent in the way you present your ministry. And I said to him, within the last 3 days, within the basics, I said to him, I said, if God has graced me with a little more eloquence in speaking and talking, I will be your advocate. I will advocate for your ministry. Paul, in this couple of verses, he said, when I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. And someone would say, we just read that. But you know, one of the interesting and the funny thing about reading and life is that we forget within the, and it's probably because I'm getting old. With my children, I'm like, they'll say, Dad, you said that or you didn't say that. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. In verse 2, Paul says this, says, for I resolved to know nothing while I was with you. And then those 3 words, I said, I want to take those 3 words, and I want our congregation and I want our people to think, resolve to know. What did Paul resolve to know? And there's a word that's kind of related to resolved, right? Either the problem is resolved, something has been, something has been resolved. Something is kind of finished in some ways. But there's another word that I was kind of, okay, I have some, okay, she's not here, okay. So the English teacher is not in this room, so that's okay. So the variation that I want to think about, I looked at the word resolved, and then I said, that word sounds a little bit like resolution, right? So resolution, resolve to know. Paul decided that he's going to, decide on this. It's kind of a decision that he made. And then so I was thinking as I was preparing the message, I said something like, okay, this is the end of, we're getting to the end of July. And then if I'm correct, most New Year's, and see, this is one of the things that happens with age, and I'm only 54, okay? But it's like, okay, did I share this somewhat in January? Yes or no? I'm not really sure, but about resolutions, right? I like to preach always about this thing about New Year's resolutions. And so you say, why are you bringing it up in July, right? See, that's my point. Because one of the things that we talk about in resolutions, and the question is, did you make a New Year resolution? Did you make a New Year resolution? And then sometimes people say, oh, I stopped making resolutions. You know why? Because I lose them after, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And then the most popular kind of resolutions go something like this, right? Okay, I'm going to eat better. I'm going to lose some weight. I need to, somebody has been getting on my case about losing this little belly that, and then the other things, maybe a little more complicated, would be, I want a more organized, orderly life. And then if you come a little bit more of like a personality or a character kind of thing, it's like, this year, when I say some things, this is something that I used to make resolutions all the time. Okay, I made these resolutions for the last, I got married in 1989, so close to 30 years, I make a resolution to my wife and says, okay, I'm going to keep my word, I'm going to keep my promises. How many of you made resolutions about either your diet, your exercise, orderly life, keep your promises, keep your word? The other thing is, hopefully, because as we are Christians, one of the things I know, in the beginning of the year we say, oh, I'm going to read the Bible more. I'm going to pray more. And those are spiritual resolutions, hopefully we make in the beginning of January. How long, if you made them, do you still keep it? Do you still keep them? I'm not sure. That's a question that only you can answer. Paul made a resolution. And if we look at the life of Paul, I would say he kept the resolution that he made. Because he had an encounter, if we remember and if we think about the life of Paul, Paul had an encounter with someone, right? Paul initially did not care for Jesus Christ. Paul initially did not care for the teaching and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He persecuted all the Christians in the beginning. But then he met Christ. And that changed his life. And from then on, in 1 Corinthians, when he talks about, when he says, I resolve to know, I think this is part of his resolution, part of his change in his life, that when he met Jesus Christ, his life changed completely, totally. And when we look at the life of Paul, all the pains, sufferings, and if you look, okay, off the top of my head, I'm sorry, but when Paul talks about, for the sake of faith, for the sake of Christ, I've been beaten a number of times. I believe one less than 40 lashes, right? Because the Jewish law was if you beat them 40 times with the lash, they might die. So give them one less. So it's just before death. He says, I've been beaten. I've been shipwrecked. You know, one thing that I can, off the top of my head, if you remember, when he was preaching the gospel and he was sharing the gospel, they stoned him. And they threw him out of the gate, thinking that he was dead. But you know what happened? He got up. And then, okay, if someone is about to stone you, and they did stone you, and they throw you out the gate, if you get up and if you're alive, what would you do? I would say, get away from there as far as possible. But what did Paul do? Paul got up, it says, if you read in Acts, it says, Paul got up, and then he went back. He went back to the people that were stoning him. He said, you try to stone me, but I'm still alive, and I still want to tell you about Jesus Christ, who changed my life. You know, humanly, when we think about that, that is just like crazy stuff. It's one of the, if I want to use this word, it is the most idiotic thing that a person would do. Why would you go back to the people who wanted us, who, not just wanted to, but they stoned you. They want you dead. So you come up, you get up, and then you go back. See, in chapter 2, that's what he says about, I resolved to know nothing. But then we have to kind of go back to chapter 1 for a little part of the reason, right? Because in chapter 1, Paul, towards the end of chapter 1, he says this. He says, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. You know, I just said that what Paul did was one of the most idiotic, stupid thing that a person would do, right? How many of you and I, you know that someone dislikes you, hates you, they hate your guts, they want you to be dead, but you're willing to go to them back and say, can you give me a chance and let me tell you that Jesus loves you? That I just want to tell you the message of the cross? So in earlier verses continue, he said, Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom. But Paul says, but we preach Christ crucified. And he says, that's a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. And the rest of the passages Paul just kind of elaborates a little bit more about how, if you remember, the Jewish people, they were waiting for a Messiah, right? But the Messiah that the Jewish people were waiting for was someone that would come, a military leader, commander, who would get rid of the Romans who were persecuting them for the last how many years, and then to reestablish the kingdom that David established in Israel. And then Solomon maintained and made a beautiful temple filled with gold, gilded with gold. And that's what the Jewish people were looking for. We want a Messiah who is so powerful, who is so strong, who has such charisma that he will get the people, he will be a leader, a strong leader, and get rid of them all. And then Paul says, no, see, that's what the Jewish people want, but that's not what God is sending. And that's not who God sent. And then he also says, for the Jewish people, they want a sign. But for the Gentiles, and then the Gentiles, I want to clarify specifically a group of the Gentiles are the Greeks. Because if you remember in Acts chapter 17, Paul goes to Athens. And he looks around, and when we say Athens, okay, anyone with I don't know, whichever, but when we say Athens, do you know what is the first thing that we think about in Athens? Can anyone give me a name? If I say Athens, who represents Athens? Alexander the Great. Well, Alexander the Great kind of took over the known world at the time. But if we say Athens, okay, Athens, we think about Greek philosophy, okay? That's where Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, how many hundreds of years ago before Christ? But Athens is, when we say Athens, we say philosophy. And that's why when Paul talks about where is the wise person, where is the teacher of the law, where is the philosopher or the sage, and when Paul says, I resolve to know, to me it came to that knowledge. See, because Athens, as we would say, is the foundation of all non-Christian knowledge. It's the foundation and the basis of all non-Christian knowledge. But in the chapter 1 and chapter 2, you know what Paul is saying? Paul says, the Jewish people who are looking for a sign, all the Gentiles, the Greeks in Athens, or the Greeks who believe that they are the smartest people in their time, or whichever it is, he says, see, for those, the cross is foolishness. But Paul says in verse 2 of chapter 2, he says, for I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except. And when Paul says except, he says, Paul, we also say is one of the smartest men of his time. He said he studied under Gamaliel, who we would say is like the Harvard of that time. And so he studied under him and was going to take over his ministry or take over his teaching, whichever way it is. But he's very smart, a very wise person. But Paul says, I resolve to know nothing except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And then the previous verse in chapter 118 where it says, the message of the cross. See, because for Paul, the most important thing in his life, the most important thing in Paul's life became his encounter with Jesus Christ. And knowing and understanding the knowledge and the message of the cross. And we've come to a point in our Christian life and in Christianity that we come to a point, and when we look at icons, when we look at certain things, we just kind of come in and day out, and we're just like, we just kind of habitually look at them, but we forget the significance and the meaning of these things. So if I say to you right now, how many crosses do we have in this building right now, or in this room right now? There's two on the screen, right? We have two on the screen, one in the back, one in the front. But we also have one here. And then someone reminded me, see, I forgot that too. Thank you. There's one on the ceiling. For the people who are new, have you ever noticed we have a ceiling on the, sometimes, seriously, I'm sorry, but sometimes I look at that cross up on the ceiling and I'm like, what if, right? What if, okay. I'm like, God forbid, right? Okay. This is not wood, but whichever. But the cross. And then, in preparation for the message, I knew that today is the fourth Sunday. When we look at the cross, look at the one here, look at the one in the ceiling, and then when we look at our church's logo, one of the first things when I came to this church about 10 years ago, Pastor Sam, he was very excited about the logo. I looked at the logo, I'm like, it's very nice, it's cute. I'm not of the artistic kind, all right? Okay, so I'm just putting it out there to make sure that it's not because but I was like, okay. Then he explained to me, he said, look at the cross. The figures underneath are carrying that cross, right? And then he says, look at the different colors. It represents the diversity. And then I looked at it and I said, very impressive, very nice. Because we want a church of diversity. We want a church. And then there's three figures. Okay, I'm not going to go into the Trinity thing, okay, so I don't want to even go there. But there's three. But they're carrying the cross. And one of the things that I've recognized within the last 10 years of my interaction with Pastor Sam is, I think if I'm correct, last year is together. Don't do it alone. Together. Paul had his fellow workers. So we look at the cross, there's three underneath, they're working together. Carrying the cross together. See, carrying the cross together, do you think that's an easy task? See, one of the things that I recognize and that I notice is that I know that our two men who went to India, and then there was a little blurb, I believe last year, about the Delhi belly, right? And those who know, those who don't, okay. It's, the bowel movements are very irregular. It's very difficult. Very difficult in the mission field. But if we look at the cross of our church's mission, it is to raise devoted followers of Christ. And our logo says, we're going to carry the cross together. But here's my challenge to you. One of the things that I love about the inner city missions is when I go there, I'm reminded of how I don't really want to carry the cross. I look at him, I look at Pastor Eddie, and for those of you who know him, he has a daughter, a son, and a daughter. And then I look at his difficult life, day in and day out in the trenches. And then I look at my life, comfortable world, comfortable life that I live. And then when I first became a Christian, and when we were all beginning Christians, hopefully, as we were growing, we said, I'm going to follow Christ. I'm going to live for Christ. And then a lot of times, in the missions conferences, this is the thing that we ask for. We say, I'm going to live for Christ. I'm going to die for Christ. Why? Because if we think about the cross, the message of the cross is that Christ died for you. Christ died for me. And this is something that I've said many times in my preaching. If someone was willing to die for me, what am I willing to do for him? Carrying that cross together, and by the grace of God, it's not by myself, but together. Hopefully that makes it a little easier. But Christ took his cross all by himself. All of his disciples that he trained, ate with, and taught for 3 years, they all deserted him. His most trusted disciple said, oh, nothing's going to happen to you. I will die for you. I will die with you. And then what happened? Are you a follower of Jesus Christ? He said, who's Christ? I don't know him. I don't know him. And unfortunately, when I look at my life, when I think about my interactions sometimes, I say, we kind of, we put people in guilt by saying, how many of you are a little embarrassed in the world in which you live in, that you're kind of embarrassed? Like I did youth ministry many times, for many years, and I said, are you embarrassed when you're at school to pray in front of your friends because you don't want to answer the fact that you're a Christian? In our passage this morning, Paul said, I resolve to know nothing except Jesus Christ. Knowing correctly and accurately is very important. The other thing that kind of pops into my head that I want to share with you about knowing. I remember when I was a Christian and I was, growing, and there was a book that I shared many times with our congregation. There's a book called Knowing God. It is what we would call a classic of J.I. Packer. And just the title itself is just Knowing God. But, I'd been in Bible college for a number of years. I read the Bible, 2-3 hours a day at that time. But I started reading this book. And in whether it was the first chapter or the second chapter, there's a line that he wrote. He says, you can know a lot about God and not know God. When I read that sentence, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Here I am, I'm at a Bible college, I'm reading the Bible, I'm studying the Word, and he said, and then the story that goes is two men are having a conversation. One is a pastor who had difficulty, and I think, if I remember the details correctly, he was kicked out of his fellowship or whichever. And then the two of them are having a conversation, and the one man says to the other, does it not disappoint you, does it not depress you that you've been kicked out, that they no longer recognize you, approve of you, accept of you? And the man said, oh, that's okay, because from my estimation, unfortunately, they do not know God, but I know God. And think, when I read, it said, you can know a lot about God, but not know God. That means you can have Bible knowledge. But it turns out that if you don't interact with Him on a daily basis, praying and developing that relationship, how is your relationship with God? My friend who is the, I don't know, when he was giving his testimony, he said they have at YWAM, there's I believe it's a 5-month training session. 3 months, they get biblical knowledge, and then 2 months they're sent out to the rest of the world. He said next week he's going to go to Kenya and Uganda to visit the team that's out there. He says there's only one question that he asks when he goes out there. He says, how is your relationship with God? How is your relationship with God? See, Paul said, I resolved, my resolution is to know nothing else. You know, if I make it too extreme, it is a little problematic, because we do need to know a lot of things, right? That's why we have schools and colleges and universities. The knowledge that we acquire will help us. The knowledge that we acquire will help us get a better job, and then a better job will help us to get, you know, a better job, more money, and all these things. But Paul says, I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. What is the most important knowledge that a person needs to have? And I was thinking about, with the Knowing God book, the man who shared the gospel with me, the first meeting that I had with him, he looked at me. He was an American man, and he looked at me and says, Kwang, have you ever thought about being a preacher? And when he said that, I just kind of chuckled, because at that time I was about 21 years old. I grew up in the church, but I hadn't gone to church for like 2-3 years. And I said, my answer to him was, if I became a preacher, that church would die. But then God changed me. And then it was very interesting. A couple years later, I went to him, I said, why did you, it was the first time that I was meeting you, why did you say that? And he said, for some strange reason, the Holy Spirit prompted me to ask you that question. And a number of experiences that I've had, I acquired a lot of knowledge. Some people know, you know, I'm always I have too many books in my house, because I love to read. I love to read. I love to read. When I go to the library, I have about 15 books out of the library. I want to read them, and I can't choose which one. There are too many books in my house. But what is the most important knowledge of them all? For you, what resolutions have you made? What knowledge is the most important knowledge to you? See, Paul said, after he met Christ, after he was called, he said, I resolved to know nothing except Jesus Christ crucified, for me and for the believers. I pray that, you know, like I said, this is July. If you made a resolution in January, whether it be the diet or those things are secondary. But the most primary and important resolutions that we can make is, I want to be a better Christian. I want to grow. I want to grow in knowing more of the knowledge and the wisdom of God. I pray that that would be your, I don't know, it's not the new year, but I pray that that would be a resolution that you make. That the most important knowledge and the most important decision and the resolution that you make is to know Christ and Him crucified. Let's pray.